Okay. So once again, we're going to begin in our study of Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 30, and see how far we get. And I would like to have a volunteer read verses 12 through 18 to begin with. All right, thank you very much. Very interesting concepts Paul brings to light here, but first I want us to note that as we've been reading so far, remember, Paul is in prison as he's writing this, but look at the language that he uses. Look at the attitude that he has. He's very optimistic, he's very thankful, and he's very grateful for what is happening here. He's very almost grateful to be in prison, because he says that his imprisonment serves to advance the gospel. And what a great example for us, when we have little trials in life, how sometimes we get down and we let ourselves kind of become very, get into a self-pity mode because we're having problems in our lives. Well, here's Paul in prison. And he's thankful, he's rejoicing, he's optimistic, he's looking forward to the future, and he is grateful for what is happening with the gospel. It reminds us of the attitude that he exhibited in Acts chapter 16 and verse 25. Paul and Silas both, when they were in prison there in Philippi, and they were praying and singing. And everybody could hear them. They were praying and singing so that everyone could hear, and everyone knew that they were praising God. And so let's just keep that example in mind as we go through some of the struggles that we have in life. But Paul does say that his imprisonment served to advance the gospel. And in verse 13 he said his imprisonment was for Christ. He says the imperial guard knew it. He says all the rest knew it. Whoever all the rest is, I guess all the rest of the people that were with him or around him during this time. How did they know that Paul's imprisonment was for Christ? They knew what he was charged with. Okay. Which was what? We'll look at that. They knew what he was charged with. All right, and we'll look at that. But what was the purpose? Well, what was the purpose for Paul's imprisonment? I guess we'll go ahead and look at that now. I'd like to look at Acts chapter 21, which is where all of this began, if we are to take his imprisonment here to be the Roman imprisonment. Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 30 is where this all began. Paul is back in Jerusalem. He's visiting James, and he has taken a vow. And in verse 27 it says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And if you continue reading, you see that there was such an uproar that the Romans got involved and took Paul away. And so here we have this charge raised, and it raises an uproar, and that's where the journey to his imprisonment begins. This charge that he is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and that he brought Gentiles into the temple. Was any of that true? No, none of that was true. None of that was true. But it was simply a charge brought to get Paul to do what? Exactly. To get Paul to shut up, to stop teaching, to get him out of the way. Let's look over at chapter 22 now, from verses 17 through 24. And so Paul is making his defense. And in verse 17 he says, "When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him," meaning Jesus, "saying to me, 'Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me.' And I said, 'Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, Go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles.' Up to this word they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, 'Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live.' And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this." So, the first time that Paul mentions going to the Gentiles, there's an uproar. No, he can't possibly be telling the truth. This has got to be blasphemy because God hates the Gentiles. Well, they've forgotten what Isaiah said in Isaiah 42:1 and 49:6, that Jesus, that the Messiah would be the salvation of the nation, that he would be the justice for the Gentiles, for the Gentile nations. And so, but it was different. It wasn't what they believed themselves, and so they were going to make Paul shut up by causing an uproar. Again, in chapter 23, and verses 6 through 15, we see again that Paul is making a defense, and he causes an uproar. And then and they bring him back to the prison, and Jesus says to him in verse 11, "The following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome.' When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy," and so on and so forth. So again, we see they're just trying to get rid of Paul. They're just trying to get rid of Paul. And that was man's purpose for Paul's imprisonment, to shut him up, to get him to stop teaching about Christ. What was Jesus' purpose for his imprisonment? Okay? And we see right here in verse 11, Jesus says exactly what the point of all this is. "As you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." There was a point to all of this. And so here the imperial guard and all the rest that were with Paul, they see Paul in prison, they see his attitude, they know that he's there because he preached Christ, they know that he's there so that he won't preach Christ anymore, but what's happening instead? The gospel is advanced. I need to, speaking of shutting things up, I need to shut my tablet up. The gospel is advanced instead. So their man's best efforts to stop the advance of the gospel by putting Paul in jail not only fails, but turns out to advance the gospel further. And the guard sees that, the imperial guard, and all the rest, everyone around Paul sees that. And it causes Paul to rejoice. Any further comments on that? All right, well, let's move on then. Verse 15. Now this is, to me, one of the most interesting passages in the New Testament. Well, the advancement of the gospel while Paul's in prison doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense either. Because the gospel is advancing, but through envy and rivalry. How does that make any sense at all? He says in verse 15 that some are preaching out of goodwill. In verse 16, he says that they're preaching out of love, that they know that Paul is there for the defense of the gospel. And just as we described last time, they wanted to be partners with Paul. They wanted to help Paul in his ministry. And so they were emboldened by the fact that what we were just talking about, that here Paul is in prison, but the gospel is advanced. And so they're emboldened to go out and preach. But that's one side, and that kind of makes sense. We understand that people were there to help Paul. People were out there trying to help advance the gospel for the sake of Paul. But then some are preaching from envy and rivalry. And Paul says that they're proclaiming Christ in verse 17 out of selfish ambition. That they're not sincere in what they're doing. And they're attempting to afflict Paul during his imprisonment. They're trying to hurt Paul by preaching Christ. How can we make any sense of that? How does that work? What does Paul mean here? Okay. Yeah, almost like, well, now Paul's in prison. Now's my chance to make a name for myself. I think might be the idea. And sometimes we see that today. Sometimes we hear about preachers that are trying to vaunt themselves and put themselves out there as more or less leaders of the church. Make a name for themselves. And that's not right. That's not right. It's the wrong motive, right? And do you think Paul has any reason to bring this up to the Philippians in particular? Especially if you've had a chance to read the entire letter, you might have seen this somewhere else. Look at Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5. Did I say the right verse? No. Verse 3. Okay, so is Paul rejoicing over the envy and rivalry and the insincerity that these people are displaying? No, obviously not, because here he speaks against it. And perhaps this is why, maybe the Philippians have a problem with that. And that's why he even brings it up here. But what does Paul rejoice about in this case? Okay, they're still preaching Christ. So he still is rejoicing over that fact. Because he is in prison, some are emboldened to preach Christ in order to help him, and some are emboldened to preach Christ in order to hurt him. He doesn't care. I don't care why they're preaching Christ. All I care about is that Christ is preached. And that is a good thing. That's a wonderful thing. And it made me think, isn't it wonderful that our salvation has nothing to do with the sincerity and the integrity of the person that taught us. It's all about my sincerity and integrity and my devotion to Christ, and not the one that teaches me. Because otherwise, I'm sure Paul would not be rejoicing as much if that was not the case. what teaching of Jesus, this is kind of a weird question, so I may have to restate it or something. But anyway, what teaching of Jesus is Paul fulfilling in this passage? Does anything come to mind that Jesus taught in what Paul is going through here? Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. Certainly, I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good one. It doesn't matter if he's doing God's will. It doesn't matter if he's over here or over there. With doing it himself, he's still doing God's will. So that's one thing. But Paul, I'm thinking more of Paul's personal experience and what he's dealing with these people that are envious and rivalrous. Word? I don't think so. But you know what I mean. I was thinking of, you could go to Matthew 5, but I went to Luke chapter 6 just to be contrary. Luke chapter 6, verses 22 through 23. Here are people that obviously hate Paul in some, to some degree. They hate the fact that he is so, well known that they're not. It seems to be the case. And so Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers did to the prophets." So now, and it's not just the other teachers that are out there that I'm talking about. It's all that's happening to Paul. The very fact that he's in prison, the very fact that he has been so reviled and persecuted, and yet here he is rejoicing because Christ is preached, because the gospel is advanced. And that's exactly what Jesus said to do. Jesus said that's what the fathers did to the prophets. And so that's one way that we know we're on the right side. All right. Any other comments before we move on? We might get a little farther than I thought. Could I have someone read? Where did we leave off? 19, verse 19 through the end of the chapter, please. Okay, thank you. So Paul, he says in verse 19 that he is confident that he will be delivered. He is confident of deliverance. And that's another cause for rejoicing in the latter part of verse 18. And he says the deliverance comes through the Philippians' prayers. So does this mean that Paul is expecting to be released from prison? Is that what he's talking about? He's talking about salvation. Okay, exactly. And we see that in verse 20, beginning in verse 20. His expectation is that I will not be at all ashamed, that he will have full courage, that Christ will be honored in his body, whether by life or death. So there's the answer there. And then he talks about that choice, life or death. Beginning of verse 21, to live is Christ, to die is gain. To live is Christ. In verse 22, to live is to have fruitful labor. And to live is more necessary for the Philippians in verse 23. But to die is gain. In verse 23, he has a desire to be with Christ. And he says that is far better from his point of view, to go be with Christ. And so either way, whether he lives or dies, he will honor Christ with his body. That reminds me of Colossians chapter 3. Let's look at Colossians chapter 3, verses 15 through 17. Which says, "And let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." Well, everything that Paul has just said in this passage, we've seen him do in Acts 16 and in the writing of this letter to the Philippians. And now he's saying that whatever happens to him, he knows that Christ will be honored in his body. But in verse 22, he makes an interesting statement. Go back to Philippians 1 and verse 22. A statement which I'm not clear on. I'm not exactly sure what he means by this. He says, "Yet which I shall choose." Let me back up to the beginning of that verse. "If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me." Let me back up to verse 21 just to make sure we get the context. "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell." Why does Paul say that? Is it really up to him whether he lives or dies? Does he get to make that choice? Which he would prefer. Okay? And so, whichever he would prefer, whichever he thinks is best, then what would he do about that? He would pray for that, right? So I mean, you tell me what you think, but I think that's probably what he means, is that he's not sure what to ask for. I'm not sure whether to ask to die and be with Christ. I would love to do that. I would love to be with Christ. That would be the best thing for me. Or should I ask to live so that I can continue to work, so that I can continue to bear fruit and help these Philippians. Which one does he choose in the end? Okay, to stay there and work for them. And it's not because he loves life, because he's obviously said, I would much rather be with Christ. That would be the best for me. He doesn't love life, but he loves the Philippians. And he loves Christ in verse 21. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So Paul is convinced that living will benefit the Philippians. And we see in verse 25 that it will be for their progress and joy in the faith. And I just realized it's past time to ring the bell. Craig, would you mind ringing the bell? Do you know where it is? It's okay. All right, Keith will get it. Thank you. Yeah. So it'll be for their progress and joy in the faith, and it will give them ample cause in verse 26 to glory in Christ Jesus. And so this will all come from Paul having an opportunity to be with the brothers of Philippi. And so he has confidence that that is what will happen. So while Paul wants to be with Christ, he knows that he is of more service to Christ if he remains alive. And that's what we read in Colossians, that whatever we do it in the name of the Lord. Any further comment on that part of the passage? All right. The last section. I don't know if I want to get into the last section because we'll have to stop. We'll have to cut it short. Maybe I'll save that for next time. That's kind of where I thought we would get to. But I'll just say this, that this last section, 27 through 30, it's almost as if he changes gears just a little bit. Not changes gears, but he moves from being thankful and rejoicing and looking forward to being with them, and then says, now hold it. You guys can mess this up if you don't let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. And so we'll talk about this warning, and really I think this kind of is the launching point into the rest of the book, into the rest of the letter, where he begins to warn them about the things that they need to be concerned about, shoring up and improving on. Okay, so I think we'll stop there. Any comments? Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Right. That's a very good point. Because Paul was concerned about more than just himself. And yes. So that's very clear. That's what he wanted to do is help the Philippians. That was his number one goal. And in so doing, he would serve Christ. All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you for all your comments, and we'll pick up there on Sunday.